Vikings, Influence on the English Language. Ethan Ashbrook, Nika Cooper, Tuedo, Lee Ricklin. Intro. Have you ever thought about how odd English is? Have you ever questioned some of the weird grammar rules or vocabulary? Have you ever thought about how it came to what it's like today? Old English and modern English we use today do not seem to share many similarities. However, modern English is merely the outcome of lots of historical moments that changed the vocabulary and grammar of English. Invaders throughout the history of England helped expand the language's vocabulary. Immigrants and conquerors helped change the grammar, and the Vikings were not an exception. Vikings played an essential role in the development of Old English to what we consider English today. It is extremely important to understand the Vikings' influence on history and Norse's influence on English vocabulary and grammar to understand the evolution of the English language.
The main way Vikings came in contact with the English before the 11th century was through raids. Since Vikings could easily profit from raids on a defenseless England, they did so. Once the English finally had the ability to fight off the Vikings would settle down in England as traders, farmers, and bodyguards. Even before this time period, Vikings inhabited Britain with permanent winter bases. In this contact, many Viking words started to filter into the English words. For example, words that started with SK tended to be from Scandinavian origin, like skin or sky. Other words that came from the Vikings tended to deal with trade, farming, and marriage, which were the types of contexts that these two cultures tended to interact in. This section of the video will attempt to explain how these two cultures met and in which context to explain how the Vikings impacted the English language. The native British were at a geographical advantage compared to their European counterparts. The English Channel was good at naturally protecting the native inhabitants, but there was one nation that could bypass this natural barrier, the Vikings. With their signature strand hog raiding technique, they could easily profit from raids with their amazing navigation and quick travel. They were a huge part of the English people's lives. In the span of a few centuries, these people would first raid, and then conquer, and then settle in with the English. Vikings had been raiding along the English Channel for a long time before the 8th century. However, by that time, the Vikings were setting up permanent bases, like in Dublin. While Vikings would usually sail into England with the spring winds and sail away in the autumn with the changing winds, in these permanent raids, they would set up winter bases in enemy territory and sail away the next year to maximize profit. However, by the 9th century, native English resistance was heightening, and this deterred the Vikings from raiding as much, and many set to farming. Raiding was accelerated into the 10th century in huge numbers. In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, the Viking Age was ended with their last defeat to the English. So what happens after that? The Vikings were already in England at this time, and would continue to stay farming and trading. This now peaceful contact with the northern men prompted trade of words that had to deal with farming, marriage, and trade itself. Farming and marriage and trade were the main ways these two cultures interacted, so it's not surprising these languages meshed in those areas. For example, the farming words skill and egg come from Scandinavian origin. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in Scandinavian relations with the English.
It's pretty clear that modern English isn't the same as Old English, or even Middle English. But the change wasn't only in vocabulary. English also experienced a giant grammatical shift. The Vikings played an important role in simplifying English grammar into something similar to what it is today. Historian John McWhorter made the following argument about how and why the Vikings simplified English. First of all, how do we know that the Vikings of all people affected the English grammar? After all, the Normans were arguably the most influential invaders. The important distinction to make here is that the Normans were the quote-unquote elites compared to the English peasants, while the Vikings were on more equal grounds with the English. Because the Normans conquered the English, they became known as the elite of English society. They rarely interacted with their English subjects and controlled England from France as one of its provinces. But this brings up a few problems. If the Normans ruled England from France, then that would mean that there would be very few Normans in England at any given time. On top of that, the Normans rarely interacted with the peasants, meaning that the peasants wouldn't hear them speak French, much less try and understand it. The Normans weren't around the English in their language enough to effectively change the grammatical structure of it. Alternatively, when the Vikings arrived in England, they decided to settle among the people, instead of try conquering. Living among English required the two having to communicate, and so the Vikings had to speak a basic type of English with the Norse interspersed. In 887 AD, the Vikings created a treaty of sorts with the English, saying that the Vikings would live in an area of eastern England known as the Danelaw, or Danish land. From then on, most of the Vikings who came to England ended up settling in the Danelaw. Because this area was mostly made up of people of Norse descent, they all spoke a similar form of broken English. The biggest thing that influenced the English language was its children. As the Vikings settled in England, they had children, sometimes with the English people. Most of the children couldn't read or write, so they learned English by listening to how others spoke it. Children in the Danelaw were only ever exposed to the simplified broken English that they spoke there, so that was what they learned to speak. As more and more generations of children grew up around there, they spoke a more and more developed version of broken English, eventually developing the languages into what we know today as Middle English. Over time, the language spread from the Danelaw to the rest of England.
We can figure out for certain that the Vikings are to blame for the simplification of the English language. For one, English's suffixes disappeared around the period of the time the Vikings began to intermarry and pass on their version of English to their children. On top of that, English began to stop having a grammatical gender, making it the only Indo-European language in Europe to lack it. The former point proves that the disappearance of gender didn't just occur through the evolving of language. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the only language in Europe to also lose grammatical gender. Therefore, we have to assume that it was a specific historical event that led to a large increase in the population speaking a more simplified version of English. It is the Viking settlement in England that fits these criteria most. Interestingly, a Norse who spoke Old Norse and an English person who spoke Old English could understand each other to a certain extent. English and Norse are both Germanic languages, so they shared a lot of vocabulary, which is all that they needed to have a basic conversation. There is additional evidence to how Vikings affected the grammar. Also near the time of the disappearance of suffixes and grammatical gender came the disappearance of reflexive verbs, the phrases thither and whither, and the use of a separate pronoun for you all. As an example of simplification, take a look at this sentence. I'll sell you the horse that pulls my cart. In Old English, this sentence would be Ik säljer det that horse that draget minne wagen. In Old Norse would be Ek mun sälja det horset dragwagen mine. We can see that these sentences have very similar parts, such as vägen and wagen, or sella and selja. The only thing that's different and would have been lost in translation is the grammar. How would a Norse know that horse refers to only one horse? As the English and Norse spent more time together and they developed more of a common language, the grammar differences were lost, getting rid of things mentioned before such as gender, word endings, and reflexes on words. So in order for the Vikings to communicate with the English, they had to simplify the language, which inadvertently simplified the grammatical structure of English.
While English has gone through many revisions over time, the Vikings had arguably the largest effect on it. The history, vocabulary, and grammar changes that they brought helped mold English into what it is today.